Stanford Law School professor Hank Greely recently published an article in the Journal of Law and the Biosciences titled "The Death of Roe and the Future of Ex Vivo Embryos." His article analyzes how the political winds that gave force to the landmark Dobbs decision last year are bringing increased scrutiny to IVF, specifically the human embryos that are created and sometimes discarded during assisted reproductive technology. In this Q&A, Professor Greely discusses some of these developing issues, including the likelihood that activists might secure new limitations on IVF, particularly in connection with a related procedure, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. So, hi, Professor Greely. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talk a little bit about your fascinating article, The Death of Roe and the Future of Ex Vivo Embryos, which was published a few months back in the Journal of Law and the Biosciences. Following the Dobbs decision last summer, most of the ensuing discussion has naturally been about access to abortion. But what you explore in your article comes at things from a different vantage point. You look at the Dobbs decision's potential impact on in vitro fertilization, namely the human embryos that are created and sometimes discarded as part of the IVF process, as well as touching on research that involves human embryos. So I'll start by asking you, did Dobbs open new legal avenues to groups that might now want to push for greater protection of human embryos? Or is it the political winds that gave force to Dobbs that might now be blowing toward IVF, or is it both?
So I think the answer is mainly politics, although Dobbs did close off some possible protections for IVF. Protections that weren't likely to happen with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, but one could imagine a Supreme Court that would have expanded on rather than contracted reproductive freedom and reproductive liberty rights in a way that would have included embryos that are used for IVF. Really, IVF and embryos outside of a woman's uterus, woman's reproductive system, have not been the subject of really any court activity in the United States. I think Dobbs, though, makes that quite likely to change. And it does it in kind of an ironic way. The 49 years of Roe v. Wade really created a substantial political movement, really an impressive political movement, and it didn't grow overnight. It grew slowly and with time and a lot of effort by those who were dedicated to that issue about the idea of protecting what they call unborn babies. And many of the people who take that perspective think that that status attaches as soon as an egg is fertilized. That once there's a fertilized egg, that's an unborn baby and it needs protection. Well, Roe has obviously been the main target of the pro-life groups. Now that that target's out of the way, you've got these political organizations that are, many of which are dedicated to the idea that embryos are babies. What's next for them? And I think going after some of the other uses of ex vivo, outside the body embryos, probably makes sense, both logically and politically, for at least many of those groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting. Well, what is the current legal landscape in the United States, governing embryos that are created but not implanted during IVF, for example?
So oddly, the U.S. is almost completely devoid of any regulation of IVF. Now, the IVF industry, which hates being called an industry, but is a substantial and very profitable medical field, will tell you that no, we're extremely highly regulated, but they're regulated the way doctors and clinical labs doing anything are regulated. In most of the world, IVF and other forms of assisted reproduction are explicitly regulated. In the United States, that regulation is almost non-existent. The only federal law is one that requires clinics to report their results, although not all clinics do, because there are no penalties for failing to report your results. And then a couple of states, a few states, have banned research with human embryos. The federal government bans, or Congress through an appropriations amendment has for almost 40 years now, almost 30 years now, banned federal funds being used to destroy embryos in research. And the only other thing I can think of is the state of Louisiana. The great state of Louisiana, about 15 years ago, decided that embryos could not be intentionally destroyed. So that means in Louisiana, every extra embryo created as a result of IVF is frozen and kept indefinitely. The IVF clinics have no idea how long they have to keep these.
Fascinating.
In Hurricane Katrina, this law is old enough that it was in effect before Katrina. In Hurricane Katrina, rescue boats were dispatched to save vats of embryos that were frozen in liquid nitrogen. So that's Louisiana's law. Interestingly, Louisiana still has IVF clinics. Maybe this has made them a little bit more expensive than they otherwise would be, but the cost of storing an embryo indefinitely is pretty trivial compared to the substantial cost of doing IVF. So it doesn't seem to have affected the IVF industry substantially or significantly in Louisiana. That's the only place in the US that's really had any significant regulation of this so far.
Do you see any other states following Louisiana at this point?
Well, so maybe. In the aftermath of Dobbs, lots of states had lots of bills introduced. And I think for all of the work that went into the movement to overturn Roe, there really doesn't seem to have been very much work in thinking through, or at least creating agreement on what kind of structure should follow it. So different states have had 6-week rules, 12-week rules, 0-week rules. And some of those states have gone farther, and well, not the states, but some legislators in some of those states have gone farther and proposed bills that would affect ex vivo, outside the body embryos. In some of those bills, they make an explicit exception for IVF, and others they don't. So as far as I know at this point, no bill has been passed that clearly limits the use of ex vivo embryos, at least in assisted reproduction in IVF. But such bills have been introduced, and they could pass. The main thrust for doing that is what's called the personhood concept, where there have been efforts at the state level to declare that an embryo from the moment of fertilization of the egg is a person for purposes of the 14th Amendment, although the states can't actually rule what the federal Constitution says, but for state law purposes, and is entitled to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and so on. Personhood amendments went through a period went through a vogue about 10 years ago. And they were introduced in several states as initiatives. In Mississippi and in Colorado, they were beaten, in part because the opponents of them said, hey, this is going to mess up IVF. So there has been some history with it about a decade ago. Some of the new bills that are being introduced seem to be trying to revive it. But as far as I know, none of them has been passed. And frankly, I don't think they're likely to, because I think Americans like IVF. The pro-life side of this argument likes babies. They like people, probably for many of them, preferably heterosexual, middle-class people, but they like people who want to have babies, and IVF makes that possible. And in this country, there are over 1 million people who exist only as a result of IVF.
Interesting.
160,000 babies about 80,000 babies are born every year in the United States, between 80 and 100,000 that wouldn't have been born but for IVF. And that's a lot of happy parents.
Yeah.
They may not be happy when they're changing diapers or dealing with erectile vomiting or all the other things they have to do, but in the long run, that's a big lobby that is politically attractive. So I think there will be efforts to restrict IVF in the name of protecting embryos. I don't think they're going to be politically successful.
Okay.
At a large scale, there are some areas where I think there may be success.
Okay.
Ask me what those areas are.
That would be my next question. Indeed. Please, elaborate on that.
So I think that there are openings, political and legal openings, for states to try to limit IVF in some ways that don't make it impossible, but may protect some embryos from destruction. One path would be the Louisiana path, although that can't be very attractive because all those babies are frozen in liquid nitrogen perpetually.
Yeah, fascinating.
That doesn't seem like a win for anybody except manufacturers of liquid nitrogen. But another one would be, and Italy tried this, to say that you can only make as many embryos as you're going to transfer for implantation. Or to put it in the other direction, every embryo that you make, or maybe every apparently viable embryo that you make, has to be transferred into a uterus, which would mean that you'd make 1 or 2 or at most 3 embryos at a time, and all of them would have to be transferred. Italy eventually pulled back from that as a result of some court decisions. I don't think that would be very popular in the US because it probably would mean you'd have to harvest eggs more often. And egg harvest is the worst part of IVF. It's 70% of the cost, it's 98% of the unpleasantness, and it's 100% of the risk, of the actual medical risk to the woman in IVF. So I could imagine that being pushed. It might get adopted some places. I don't think that's very likely. More likely, I think, will be limitations on a variation of IVF called, because everything has to have an acronym, PGD. PGD is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. When I tell people about this, they think it's science fiction. It's actually been in clinical use since 1990. The oldest PGD baby will turn 33 sometime this year. I met the IVF doc who was responsible for her birth, and he's very proud of the fact that she's a scientist.
Ah, that's fitting.
But with PGD, what you do is you make embryos through IVF, and then you take a few cells from that embryo. These days, you usually do it when the embryo is 6 or 7 days after fertilization. It's just barely visible to the naked eye if you've got good eyes and the lighting's right, but it's got several hundred cells. And you take a few cells off, and taking a few cells off that several hundred cell embryo doesn't hurt it at all. And you do genetic tests on the cells. This has originally been done mainly to try to figure out which embryos are going to work or not, since only about 1/3 of the embryos that get transferred in IVF actually take and become fetuses and babies, 1/3 at best. But it can also be used to determine which embryos will have a genetic disease or a chromosomal disease, like Down syndrome, or like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia or Tay-Sachs disease. There are 6,000 to 10,000 of these single gene, nasty, early onset genetic diseases. Each one of them is rare, but you multiply rare by 6,000 to 10,000, and you get about 1% to 2% of live births. And many parents would like to avoid that. So PGD, especially if you know you've got a genetic disease risk in your family. So if both the man and the woman, or the sperm provider and the egg provider, are carriers of a genetic disease where they have one copy of the 2 copies they've got of the gene, one copy could cause the disease, but only if it's matched with another disease-causing copy. So each parent is healthy. They have one good copy and one bad copy. There's a 25% chance that any embryo created from them will have 2 bad copies and have the disease. You can test for that later in pregnancy. At that point, your alternative is terminating the pregnancy. You can test for that 6 days after fertilization through PGD, at which point your option is just don't transfer that one for possible implantation and pregnancy, which to a lot of people is a lot more attractive. So PGD has gone from being rare. When I first wrote about this in 2016, something like 5% of American IVF cycles included PGD. The last numbers I saw, which were from 2020, showed that it's over 50%.
Wow.
And on the coast, it looks like it's more like 70 or 80%. So PGD has really boomed. I don't think anybody's going to try to prohibit PGD overall. But in the days before Dobbs, one of the strategies the pro-life forces were taking was to propose in some states pass laws banning abortion on particular grounds.
Right.
So you can't abort based on the fetus's sex. You can't abort based on the fetus's race. And in some places, you can't abort based on a disability that the fetus would have. In a couple of states, they had very narrow and specific laws. You couldn't abort based on Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those laws are probably now constitutional after Dobbs, but they apply to terminating an existing pregnancy. I can imagine the people who are concerned about protecting embryos trying to apply that to PGD. And that has more political appeal. And it wouldn't prohibit all of IVF by any means, and it wouldn't prohibit all of PGD, although it would prohibit the main reasons or the reasons that many people would want to do PGD, which was try to avoid those nasty diseases.
And
so
how would
they're possible? Those laws
Okay.
are, I think, politically plausible, at least in some states.
Yeah. And how would they be enforced?
Well, that's a really good question. And that was a question about the selective abortion laws too.
Mm-hmm.
What the abortion laws said was they never tried to penalize the woman, although that may be the healthcare perform an abortion where the provider knows that the reason the woman is choosing an abortion is sex discrimination, race discrimination, disability discrimination. That's a pretty high standard to prove that the doctor knew that was the cause. And frankly, if I were an OB, an obstetrician faced with that kind of situation, I'd probably, as part of the informed consent, say, now, if you end up telling me that you're only aborting this fetus because of these reasons, then I cannot legally perform the termination. So I think enforcement would be a real problem, and enforcement could also be a problem with PGD, though in a way it's a lesser problem. You think about it, if let's say there are 10 embryos, which is not unusual, 5, 8, 10 embryos, and the couple or the woman picks one of them, why did you pick that one? And
Yeah.
why didn't you pick this other one that would have had a trisomy 13 or Lesch-Nyhan disease or any of these other things? So it might be a little easier with PGD than it is with abortion, but it's never going to be really easy to enforce.
Yeah.
Although having said that, physicians are very litigation averse.
Mm-hmm.
So even some of the state laws that were of questionable constitutionality before Dobbs, I kept waiting for a OB in Texas to say, I'm going to go ahead and do this because I think Texas State Bill 8, their abortion bounty hunting bill, is unconstitutional. And as far as I know, nobody went ahead and actually did an abortion and said, I've just violated the law, come and get me.
Yeah, right.
Doctors are, and I understand it. They've got a lot on the line. Their licenses, among other things. They're risk averse. So even it doesn't take much to scare many doctors off.
Okay, interesting. So when you started your article that we're talking about here, Dobbs had not yet been handed down, although I think by the time you were finalizing your article, the decision had been leaked. So I wonder if in the months, since the decision came down, has anything surprised you about what has or maybe has not unfolded in the realm of embryo protection or IVF, since the Dobbs decision, or is it just too early to know?
Yeah, well, I will say when I was starting to write it, Dobbs hadn't come down and the draft opinion hadn't leaked. But anybody reading the transcript or following the news of the oral argument in December of 2021 knew that Roe was dead. It was pretty clear from the oral argument what was going to happen, and what was clear from the oral argument is in fact what happened. And Chief Justice Roberts tried to carve an intermediate position, but the others, Kavanaugh maybe vaguely in between, but there were 5 for flat out overrule. So I can't take credit for any great clairvoyance in starting this article before even the draft opinion leaked. I guess I've been surprised at how apparently disorganized and muddled the reaction has been in very red states, where the legislators had been very eager to pass all sorts of laws limiting and banning and prohibiting and hamstringing abortion and abortion clinics when they couldn't be enforced because of Roe v. Wade. But once they got a chance to do things, they haven't done as much as one would have expected, I think, because they really weren't prepared for it.
Interesting.
And in part because, part of that isn't greatly surprising. It's always easy to say things that appeal to your base when you know that they're not actually going to go into effect. Really, what surprised me the most is more restrictive laws have not been passed after Dobbs, in part because there seems to have been insufficient planning and coordination to figure out what exactly they wanted to say. And the legislators are now realizing that some of what their base wants them to say is broadly unpopular with much of the population. I think that is why we haven't seen anything thus far. I haven't seen anything thus far taking aim at IVF. I think these newly empowered legislators they're out there on the frozen lake. Now they can go out on the frozen lake, but they're not quite sure how thick the ice is in various places.
Okay, that's an interesting analogy. Yeah. Okay, well, this has been fascinating. I do want to ask you one question about your 2016 book, which I have not read, but has just seemed so fascinating. I have to ask you at least one question about it. So in this book, The End of Sex and the Future of Human Reproduction, you predict that a large proportion of human pregnancies will one day result from in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. Hopefully I said that right. The production of eggs or sperm that are derived from skin or other types of cells, no sex sperm or eggs required. So that's a pretty startling, prediction to some of us. How far away are we from that kind of world? And, I guess I won't ask if we want such a world. That's not what you're commenting on, I think, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
That's in the book too. The pluses and minuses of that kind of world. And I think, as with almost any technological change, there would be pluses, and there would be minuses. How far away we are from it is really a function of 2 different questions. How far away are we from being able to safely and effectively make eggs and sperm from skin cells? And the answer is, we're there already, but only if you're a mouse.
Okay.
It's been done for a while in mice. There are about 5 labs around the world that are focusing on this. It hasn't gotten a lot of grant support. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but they are working, and every year there's another paper published about another step they've made, getting closer to making human eggs and sperm from human skin cells. It involves a process called induced pluripotent stem cells, invented in 2007 by a Japanese scientist named Shinya Yamanaka. That's one of the most exciting things in human biology and medicine that's happened in this century. Because in theory, we could take cells from your skin, turn them into liver cells, kidney cells, heart muscle cells, brain cells, put them back into you. And the really exciting part about that is we wouldn't have to put you on immune suppression medication because your immune system would recognize those cells as you. So there are billions of dollars being spent on trying to figure out how to make these iPSCs, another acronym, induced pluripotent stem cells, work medically. But the iPSCs, what makes them special is they can make every cell type in the body. We know that because basically we are the products of what were called the inner cell mass of the 6-day-old embryo when it was called a blastocyst. And those inner cell mass cells do the same thing that iPSCs do. And if they can make every cell type in the body, that's not just skin and liver and lung and brain, but it's also egg and sperm. It's been done in mice. I think there's no reason to think it will be impossible in humans, but reproduction varies a lot from species to species. We saw that with cloning. Some species were easy to clone. Mice were easy, rats were hard. Dogs were hard, cats were easy. For 15 years, we thought primates were impossible, but it turns out that primates, including humans, can be cloned. At least we can make cloned embryos. As far as I know, nobody's yet tried to make a human baby this way, though they might be. With making eggs and sperm from skin cells or outside the body, that's why it's called in vitro in glass, although it's actually in plastic. Gametogenesis, making gametes being both eggs and sperm. I think we'll probably be able to do it. Just in the last couple of years, we've seen some startups get into this space with some venture capital funding. So more money going into research into this area. And the main reason I think we'll want to do it is there are in the US hundreds of thousands, if not millions of couples who desperately want their own genetic children. Now, there are philosophers who say, big deal, people want a lot of things, let them adopt. Let them use egg or donor spermers, let them eat cake. But these parents really want this, and for many of them, it's a source of great anxiety and suffering. People go through 6, 7, 8, 10 rounds of expensive and physically draining, at least for the woman, IVF in order to reach this. But if you've had cancer at a young age, if you're a boy and you had mumps or another disease with a high fever at a young age, if you got injured in the wrong place, or if you're a woman, if you're over a certain age, you don't have gametes that work. And that's a lot of people, and what I would consider a lot of human suffering, and what venture capitalists will consider a big market that wants to do this. So I think if it can be done safely and effectively, it needs to be regulated for safety. I think it will be done mainly for the purpose of helping people who desperately want to have their own genetic children have those. Once you can use it for that, though, what the book says is, well, how many eggs do you get if you make eggs from skin cells? The answer to that is, how many do you want? Scores, hundreds, thousands, millions. Wow. With egg harvest, with IVF, you get somewhere between 0 and 25. On average, around 10 or 12 from a younger woman. So let's make 100 embryos. Let's do a whole genome sequence testing on 100 embryos. Right now, that would cost about $400,000. But in 20 years, it'll cost about $400.
Wow.
Probably. And then tell the parents, okay, here's what we can tell you from these embryos genes. Well, tell us what you want to know. You want to know just about early diseases, nasty diseases? Do you want to know about disease risks? like long-term risk of Alzheimer's or breast cancer or colon cancer? Do you want to know about skin color, hair color, or eye color? Do you want to know boy or girl? That's an easy one. Do you want to know something about personality? Now, the fear here is super babies.
Yeah.
The good news is, or bad news is, we don't know how to make super babies. And we know almost nothing about the genetics of enhanced intelligence or any other behavioral traits. And brains are really complicated. They are an order of magnitude more complicated than genetics. The human brain arguably is the most complicated physical object we know of in the universe. So I don't think we'll be very good at it, but in 20 years, we may be able to say, this embryo has a 13% chance of being in the top 10% in LSAT score. Of course, that means it has an 87% chance of not being there, but some things will be clear. And I think the big selling point will be, here are 6,000 nasty genetic diseases that this embryo would not have. Now, those 6,000 genetic diseases make up 1 or 2% of babies born every year. And that may sound like pretty good odds if you're a parent. So 98, 99% chance that our baby won't have one of these. But that's playing with fire, because if your baby does have one of those, it's terrible for the baby, it's terrible for the parents, it's terrible for the rest of the family. It's a very, the consequences, and something like Down syndrome is among the least, the most benign of these genetic diseases. Some of them are, I don't even want to think about them, let alone talk about them. They're so awful. So I think parents will want to do it in order largely to have healthier babies. And I'm okay with that. I think that's a good, although there are, you get into tricky questions about disability issues.
Sure.
And parents and siblings of people with Down syndrome think it's terrible that there are fewer Downs babies being born, because they view people with Down syndrome as not only not bad, but actually very nice and wonderful, and people that there should be more of them in the world. Many parents, prospective parents, would choose not to have such a baby. So there are some, I think the hardest issues in all this genetic selection, it's not super babies, because we don't know how to do that, and I don't know that we ever will. It's the disability rights implications. I mean, let's say you've got a kid with a particular genetic disease, and now because of this, even fewer children will be born with that disease. That means less research on the disease, fewer doctors specializing in the disease, less social support for the disease, less understanding of the disease, all of which is bad for your kid.
Right.
So I think those are hard questions. Super babies, not so much.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Greely. I think we've had a great conversation, but is there anything else, about this topic or about this, your recent article? I mean, there's probably hundreds of extra things you could say, but if there's anything you feel like we didn't touch on that's important for people to know or to consider, maybe before reading your article.
So I guess the only thing I'd say is take everything that I say and everything everybody else says with a grain of salt. There's a famous saying, probably most often attributed to the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, although Yogi Berra gets some call-ins too. It's always hard to predict things, especially the future. That's wrong. It's easy to predict the future. It's just hard to be right.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that the future I predict and the end of sex and the future of human reproduction will not happen in all of its details. I think something like it will happen. And more importantly, I think anything that happens about human reproduction is really important to the future of the species as a whole, but more parochially of each of our families. So there's a lot going on. And I highly recommend that people, whatever their views on this, pay attention to it, learn about it, follow it, read newspaper stories on it. It's not only important, but it's also deeply fascinating, I think.
Indeed it is. Yes. Thank you so much.